question has been asked in print, in courts, in classrooms, in family dinner conversations, in academic seminars, and in the popular press, continuously for 150 years. It does not get easier with repetition. It does not have a stable answer. It produces in different observers of different temperaments, looking at the same set of documents, opposite conclusions arrived at by reasonable inference from honestly examined evidence. The question is, was John D. Rockefeller a villain? Not a flawed man, not an aggressive competitor, not a hard businessman. A villain, that is, a person whose actions caused identifiable harm to identifiable other persons on a sufficient scale and with sufficient intentionality to justify the moral language usually reserved for criminals rather than for industrialists. The question matters because the techniques he developed, the structures he built, the disciplines he applied are still in use.
If he was a villain, the inheritors of his methods are participating, knowingly or unknowingly, in something morally compromised. If he was not a villain, the inheritors are participating in something more like ordinary capitalism, conducted at unusual scale. The answer is not equally distributed across the political spectrum. The answer is not equally distributed across the historical record. The answer changes depending on which document you read first, and which witness you take as authoritative, and which framework of justice you apply to the evidence. This video does not resolve the question. This video presents the question as honestly as I can construct it, in the form that the question actually has, which is not a yes or a no, but a structured disagreement between two readings of the same life. The honest answer requires you to hold two readings in your mind simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other. The first reading is the prosecution case, made most articulately by Ida Tarbell in 1904, and developed by every subsequent critic of corporate concentration. The second reading is the defense case, made by Rockefeller himself in his retirement memoirs, refined by biographers like Alan Nevins in the 1940s, and embraced by the contemporary business school tradition. Both readings have weight. Both readings cite real evidence. Both readings, when held in isolation, produce a coherent moral conclusion. The difficulty, the actual intellectual difficulty of the question, is that holding both readings simultaneously produces a coherent moral conclusion as well, and it is not the conclusion either side wants you to reach. Before we hear either case, we have to establish the framework, because most arguments about Rockefeller fail because the disputants are operating under different definitions of villainy without realizing it.
There are, in the moral philosophy literature, 4 distinct frameworks under which a question of this kind can be evaluated, and the answer changes depending on which framework you apply. The first framework is consequentialist. Under consequentialism, an action is morally evaluated by its outcomes. The relevant question is, did the world become better or worse, on net, as a result of the actions in question? Under this framework, Rockefeller's case is, on balance, defensible. The price of kerosene fell from 26 cents per gallon in 1869 to 7 cents by 1890. Working-class households could afford illumination for the first time. House fires from adulterated lamp oil declined by 90%. The consolidation eliminated boom and bust cycles that had ruined thousands of operators. By the consequentialist test, Rockefeller is not a villain. He is, arguably, a public benefactor whose methods were unsavory, but whose results were unambiguously positive. The second framework is deontological. Under deontology, an action is morally evaluated by whether it violates duties that bind, regardless of outcomes. Did the actor lie, cheat, coerce, or violate the moral autonomy of persons with whom he interacted? Under this framework, the case is more difficult. The secret rebates, the drawback arrangements, the South Improvement Company contract,
the predatory pricing, the espionage against competitors that Standard Oil internal documents reveal. All of these involve deceptions and coercions. The deontological test does not care whether the outcomes were good. It cares whether the means were legitimate. By that test, the case against Rockefeller is severe. The third framework is virtue ethical. The question is not about outcomes or duties, but about character. Was the actor a person of good character, exercising practical wisdom and the cardinal virtues?
Rockefeller was, by every account, temperate to the point of austerity, just in his dealings with his employees, prudent in his planning, generous in his philanthropy. He was also capable of treating his competitors as obstacles to be neutralized, rather than as persons with whom he was in moral community. Whether that capacity is a defect of character or an unsentimental clarity about competition is the question on which the virtue ethical reading rests. The fourth framework is what philosophers call structural or systemic. The question is not about the individual actor, but about the institutional position the actor occupies. Should the position in which the actor operated have existed at all? Under this framework, the question of Rockefeller's personal moral status is almost beside the point. The villain, if there is one, is the institutional configuration that permitted a single private actor to occupy 1.5% of an entire national economy. Replace him with another actor and the same outcomes, in different details, would have followed. The fault is not in the man. The fault is in the structure that produced him. The honest answer to the question of Rockefeller's villainy depends on which of these four frameworks you bring to the evidence. Different observers, asking the same question, will arrive at different answers, not because some of them are stupid or biased, but because the frameworks themselves produce different judgments. Now let us hear the prosecution. The prosecution case, in its strongest form, was constructed by Ida Tarbell between 1900 and 1904, and it has not been improved upon since. The case has 5 components. First, Rockefeller personally directed business practices that were not only ethically dubious, but actively unlawful under the commercial standards of his own era. The drawback arrangements were condemned by every legal authority that examined them.
The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter within 60 days. The federal government, by 1911, had found sufficient evidence of unlawful conduct to dissolve the entire trust. The prosecution claims that he broke laws he knew existed systematically, and that he covered his conduct through perjury, document destruction, and witness intimidation. The evidence for each of these claims is documented in the federal investigation files of 1907 to 1911. Second, the harm to specific identifiable persons was severe and irreversible. The prosecution names names. Robert Hanna, the Cleveland refiner who sold under duress in February of 1872. Franklin Tarbell, Ida's father, crushed in the rebate wars of the 1870s, who died bitter. George Rice, a small Ohio refiner who fought Standard Oil for 30 years, and whose business was systematically destroyed through tactics that federal investigators later confirmed were coordinated from 26 Broadway. The harm was not collateral. The harm was directed, intentional, and known to the actor. Third, the harm to workers, particularly during consolidation periods, was substantial. When Standard Oil absorbed a competitor, the absorbed refinery was often closed within a year, and workers were dismissed without compensation. Tarbell documents the 1872 Cleveland consolidation, after which approximately 1,000 refinery workers were dismissed within 6 months. None received severance. The human cost was not borne by Rockefeller. It was borne by the workers of the firms he absorbed. Fourth, The political corruption sustained by Standard Oil was, by the 1880s, structural. Standard Oil retained on its private payroll members of state legislatures in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and a half-dozen other states. Federal senators were, in several documented cases, in direct personal financial relationships with the trust. The harm is to the democratic process itself.
A government quietly purchased by a private fortune cannot adequately represent the citizens who elected it.
Fifth, the pattern continued after the actor had become rich enough that no further wealth could plausibly motivate it. By 1882, Rockefeller's fortune was already among the largest in the world. The aggressive consolidations of the 1880s and 1890s were not undertaken from necessity. They were undertaken from preference. A man who continues to inflict harm on specific persons to extend a fortune he cannot personally consume has crossed a line that the consequentialist defense does not adequately address. The harm becomes its own end. That is the case. It is not a small case. It is a serious case, made by a serious investigator, supported by documents that have survived independent scrutiny for more than a century. Now turn to the historical record itself, because the record is more complicated than either the prosecution or the defense usually allows.
The Standard Oil Trust, between 1870 and 1911, did the following things, which are documented and not seriously disputed by historians of either persuasion. It reduced the retail price of kerosene by approximately 70% over a 40-year period in nominal terms, and by more than that in real terms, given general price deflation in the post-Civil War American economy. The reduction made household illumination available to households that had never had it before. By 1900, 90% of American homes had at least one kerosene lamp. In 1865, the figure had been under 30%. It standardized the product. Kerosene refined to the Standard Oil specification was safe in a way that pre-1870 kerosene had not been. House fires from adulterated lamp oil declined by 90% over the same period. The number of American deaths attributable to lamp oil explosions and fires, which had run in the thousands annually in the 1860s, declined to the low hundreds by 1900.
It built infrastructure that survived the dissolution. The pipelines, refineries, distribution networks, and shipping arrangements that Standard Oil constructed between 1870 and 1911 formed the operational backbone of the American petroleum industry for the subsequent 50 years. The successor companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, inherited not merely the assets, but the operational expertise that the trust had developed. It produced, through its disposition by Rockefeller in retirement, the largest philanthropic endowment in American history. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded the establishment of medical research as a serious discipline in the United States. The General Education Board, established in 1903, funded the founding and expansion of dozens of historically black colleges and universities in the American South, at a moment when no other major source of capital was supporting them.
The University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, and Spelman College all owe their existence, in substantial part, to the disposition of the fortune. The yellow fever vaccine, the eradication of hookworm in the American South, the establishment of modern public health practice in dozens of countries, all are direct outcomes of Rockefeller philanthropic spending. It also did the things the prosecution names. The drawback arrangements were real. The destruction of competitors was real. The political corruption was real. The worker dismissals were real. The death of Franklin Tarbell, broken by Standard Oil tactics, was a real event with a real grave in a real cemetery in Pennsylvania, which his daughter Ida visited regularly until her own death in 1944. The historical record does not, in itself, decide the question. The historical record establishes the facts. The facts are, the public benefits were real, the human costs were real, the philanthropy was real, the political corruption was real, the cheaper kerosene was real, the broken competitors were real. All of these things happened. They happened in the same enterprise, conducted by the same man, sustained by the same disciplines. The question of what to make of them is not a question the record can answer. It is a question the observer must answer with the record in hand. There is a single document in the Rockefeller archive that is, in my view, more useful for thinking about this question than any number of secondary analyses. The document is a letter written by Rockefeller in 1909, when he was 70 years old and 3 years from the dissolution of the trust, to his son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The letter is private. It was not intended for publication. It was preserved among the family papers and made available to researchers in the 1950s. The letter is long.
I will read the operative passage. Rockefeller writes, I have been thinking, my dear son, of the matters you raised in your last letter, concerning the public criticism of our business and the proper response to it. You are right that the criticism is, in many specific instances, mistaken or exaggerated. You are right that our enterprise has produced, on the whole, results of which we may be justly proud. You are right that the dissolution proceedings now contemplated by the federal government are, in their legal premises, unsound. But I want you to consider one thing, which I have only recently come to see clearly myself. The men who criticize us, Miss Tarbell, the journalists, the legislators, the various persons who have made our name a byword in the popular press, are not, in the main, motivated by personal animus, nor by mistaken facts, nor by ignorance of our public benefactions. They are motivated by something else, which is harder to address. They believe that the arrangements by which our fortune was made, however productive of cheaper kerosene and safer lamps, are arrangements that should not have been available to any private actor, regardless of how virtuous, to construct. They believe that the position we have occupied is a position that ought not to exist. The criticism is not, fundamentally, about us. It is about the position we have occupied. We have answered the criticism for 30 years as if it were about us. We may have been answering the wrong question. He continues, I do not know what to do with this thought. The enterprise has been our life's work. The benefactions have been our consolation. The discipline has been our pride. To accept the view of our critics, to accept that the position itself was the offense, would be to accept that the work of 40 years has been, at its foundation, in some sense a participation in something that should have been prevented. I cannot accept this fully. I am too old, and the work has been too central to my life to accept it. But I record it here for you, so that you may consider it as you go forward in the disposition of what we have built. Read that passage twice. The man who built Standard Oil is, in 1909, considering, privately to his son, in a letter he never expected anyone else to read, the possibility that the entire structure of his life's work was, in its foundation, morally problematic. He does not accept the view. He cannot accept it. But he records it. He passes it forward. He acknowledges in writing that the question is not what he had thought it was. This is the closest thing in the archive to a confession. It is not a confession of guilt. It is a confession of moral uncertainty. It is, in my view, the most honest sentence ever written by John D. Rockefeller about his own work. Picture the room in which the question was, in the end, decided as a public matter, though not as a moral one. It is the morning of the 15th of May, 1911.
the Supreme Court of the United States, in chambers in Washington. The case is Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States. The opinion has been argued, considered, drafted, revised, and is, that morning, about to be delivered. The Chief Justice is Edward Douglas White, recently appointed by President Taft. He sits at the center of the bench. To his right and left, the 8 associate justices. The clerks have brought in the bound copies of the opinion. The press is in the gallery. Rockefeller himself is not present. He is in his country home in Pocantico Hills, in New York, awaiting word by telegram. White begins to read. The opinion is long. It runs to 90 pages in the official report. It reviews in measured judicial prose the history of the Standard Oil Trust from its formation in 1870 through the federal government's antitrust action of 1906.
It documents the rebate arrangements, the drawback provisions, the consolidations, the pricing tactics, the corporate structure of the holding company. It does not, in the main, dispute the factual claims made by the government's attorneys. It does not, in the main, dispute Rockefeller's accounts of his own intentions. It is concerned with a narrower question, whether the conduct, taken as a whole, constitutes an unreasonable restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The court's answer is yes. The trust is ordered dissolved into its constituent parts. The dissolution must be completed within 6 months. The successor companies are to operate independently, with no cross-ownership of senior management, and with no coordinated pricing. The opinion does not, in any passage, address the question of whether Rockefeller himself is a villain. The question is not legally relevant. The Sherman Act does not prohibit villainy. It prohibits unreasonable restraint of trade.
The court finds the restraint. It orders the remedy. The moral question, the question this video is asking, is left by the court exactly where it began. The court was not the right forum to settle it. There is no right forum. In Pocantico Hills, Rockefeller receives the telegram. According to the recollection of his secretary, recorded decades later, his response is a single sentence. I had expected the result. He folds the telegram. He resumes his morning walk in the gardens. He does not, that day or any subsequent day, make a public statement about the dissolution. He lives for another 26 years. He gives away approximately $530 million of his personal fortune. He dies at Pocantico Hills on the 23rd of May, 1937, at the age of 97. He is buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, beside his wife, his parents, and the brother who predeceased him. The grave is plain. There is no inscription beyond the name and the dates.
The question of Rockefeller's villainy is, in the end, not really a question about Rockefeller. It is a question about how we, in our own century, evaluate the figures who occupy structurally similar positions in our own economy. Consider 3 current cases, briefly, in light of the framework we have constructed. First, Mark Zuckerberg, who founded Facebook, now Meta, at age 19, and now controls a social media platform used by approximately 3 billion people worldwide. His company has been credibly implicated in the spread of misinformation during multiple national elections, in the facilitation of genocide in Myanmar in 2017, and in patterns of data collection that, by the standards of any prior generation, would have been considered extreme surveillance. Under the consequentialist framework, the case is mixed. Under the deontological framework, the case is severe. The deceptions about data practices, the manipulations of feed algorithms, the suppression of internal warnings about harm. The structural framework would point out that no single individual should occupy the position Zuckerberg occupies, regardless of his personal conduct. Second, Jeff Bezos, who built Amazon into the largest retailer in the world, whose warehouse working conditions have been the subject of credible criticism from labor investigators in multiple countries, and whose competitive practices toward third-party sellers have been the subject of antitrust investigation. The parallels to Rockefeller are direct. The vertical integration, the use of internal data to compete with platform partners, the asymmetric pricing arrangements with logistics providers, all reproduce in algorithmic form the structures Rockefeller pioneered in iron and pipeline. Third, Elon Musk, who controls multiple companies of strategic significance: automotive, aerospace, satellite communications, social media, artificial intelligence, and whose personal conduct and political activities have been the subject of continuous controversy. The structural question is particularly acute. No individual private actor in any prior era has held simultaneous controlling positions in this number of strategically significant industries. In each case, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Musk. The question of personal villainy is the same question that was asked of Rockefeller, and the answer is structured by the same 4 frameworks. And the disagreement among observers tracks the disagreement among observers in 1904. The question has not been resolved. It is unresolvable under the conditions in which it is being asked. The frameworks produce different answers, and the frameworks are not themselves decidable by any meta-framework that all observers will accept.
What can be said with confidence is that the question matters. The figures who occupy these positions, whatever else they are shaping the world that everyone else will live in. Stop for a moment and notice what has just happened. You came to this video, perhaps, expecting an answer. The title asked a question. The honest answer, you may now suspect, is not a yes or a no. The honest answer is that the question, in its naive form, cannot be answered. You can apply consequentialism and get one verdict. You can apply deontology and get another. You can apply virtue ethics and get a third. You can apply structural analysis and get a fourth. The verdicts will disagree. They will disagree even if the underlying evidence is identical. They will disagree because the frameworks themselves disagree about what counts as moral evidence. This is not a failure of historical research. It is not a failure of moral philosophy. It is a structural feature of the kind of question that the question of Rockefeller's villainy actually is. Some questions have answers. Other questions have framework-dependent answers. The question of who was the first president of the United States has an answer. The question of who was the best president of the United States has a framework-dependent answer. The question of whether Rockefeller was a villain is, structurally, the second kind of question, not the first kind. What can you do with that understanding? You can do the only thing that careful thinkers have ever been able to do with framework-dependent questions, which is to hold the frameworks simultaneously, watch which way each one points, and form a considered judgment that is honest about its own foundations. If you bring a consequentialist framework, Rockefeller is, on balance, a public benefactor whose methods were unsavory, but whose outcomes were productive. The kerosene that lit working-class American homes for half a century was made possible by his discipline. If you bring a deontological framework, Rockefeller is a man who systematically violated the moral norms of commercial relationships in his own era, and who concealed his violations through deception. The harms to specific persons were real, intentional, and known. If you bring a virtue ethical framework, Rockefeller is a man of mixed virtues: temperate, prudent, just toward his employees, generous in his philanthropy, but capable of treating his competitors as obstacles rather than as moral agents. If you bring a structural framework, Rockefeller is largely beside the point. The question is whether the position he occupied should have been available to any private actor at all. Each framework is defensible. None of them is the final framework.
The choice among them is, in the end, a choice the observer must make, in light of the kind of world the observer wants to live in, and the kind of conduct the observer is willing to authorize in the figures who shape that world. That is the honest answer. It is not the answer the title of this video promised, but it is the answer that the question actually has. The grave at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland is plain. There is a low stone marker. The name is John Davison Rockefeller. The dates are 1839 and 1937. There is no inscription beyond these. Visitors who travel to the cemetery, and there are some every year who do, often expect more. They expect a monument. They expect a sentence carved into the stone that summarizes what the man took himself to have been. They expect perhaps the kind of self-justifying epitaph that the great men of the 19th century usually wrote for themselves. There is none of this. The stone says what the stone says, which is a name and 2 dates and nothing else. I have come to believe that this is, in its way, the most honest thing he ever did. He left the question of his own moral status to the people who would come after him. He did not, in the end, tell them what to conclude. He let the record speak. He let the documents speak. He let the buildings he had built, and the men he had broken, and the universities he had funded, and the rivers he had set on fire, and the workers he had dismissed, and the kerosene he had made cheap, all speak for themselves. The question I leave you with, at the end of this video, is not whether he was a villain.
The question is whether, in your own time, in your own field, in your own life, you are constructing, through your work, through your investments, through your votes, through your purchases, the kind of position that, in another century, will require another video like this one to evaluate. If you are, you will not know it. He did not know it either. The aphorism for this video is plain. The question of villainy is always answered after the fact. The position is always built before the question is asked.